At the small corner restaurant, Antonio worked every day with a smile on his face and a disposition that drew attention. It was a simple place, but a favorite among the neighborhood. Everyone knew Antonio and knew that he was the kind of person who gave his best in everything he did, from making fresh coffee in the morning to serving customers with that friendly and welcoming manner. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, and he always had a kind word for whoever walked through the door. Antonio had a busy routine, but for him, it wasn't a burden. He saw work as an opportunity to learn stories, to create bonds, and above all, to be useful. He was proud of what he did, even though many people didn't understand the value he saw in serving well. He liked knowing that his presence made people's days a little better. Behind that apron and his simple manner, there was a story that few knew. Antonio was a man of many skills and an intelligence that would surprise anyone. But at that moment, he chose to live a discreet life. For him, the important thing was not the title or status, but the pleasure of serving and the respect he earned from the people around him. His colleagues, his customers, even the owner of the restaurant saw him as someone essential, someone they could trust. And so, day after day, Antonio did what he loved. He never cared about who looked down on him, because he knew the value of his work. The restaurant was small, but it was like a family, and he felt at home there. The wooden tables, the smell of coffee and fresh bread, the soft sound of cups being placed on the counter. It was all part of a setting that he had learned to love. One day, he received unexpected news. The restaurant would be reserved for a reunion party for former high school classmates. Antonio thought it was funny. He remembered some faces, but it had been a long time since he had seen anyone from that group. He went about his routine, not imagining that that day would bring some surprises. At that reunion, many people would arrive with their expectations and impressions, and perhaps they would not recognize the man who had been one of the school's most promising students. After all, few knew how much Antonio's life had changed and how much he had grown, even amidst the simple things in life. On the night of the reunion, the restaurant was busier than usual. Antonio prepared himself with the same care as always, making sure that everything was impeccable. The tables were set, the silverware was polished, and the lights were adjusted to create a welcoming atmosphere. He knew that the night would be long and would require attention to every detail, but he was used to it. For him, each customer mattered, and even without expecting anything in return, he liked to make people feel special. When the first former classmates started arriving, Antonio went to the door to greet them. He recognized some faces immediately, but he realized that few recognized him. They were more interested in showing off to their old friends, talking loudly about their achievements, designer clothes, and, of course, taking lots of photos to record the reunion. Antonio watched everything from afar, a little amused, but maintaining a professional demeanor. And then, in the middle of that noisy and euphoric group, he spotted Claudia, an old friend with whom he had lost contact many years ago. Claudia had always been a simple and sincere person, and the reunion brought back good memories for him. She was one of the few who didn't get involved in the school's cliques and had a kind and observant look, just like his. Claudia looked around, clearly trying to locate someone she knew, until her eyes landed on Antonio. She hesitated for a moment, but the smile that spread across her face showed that she had recognized him. Claudia walked towards him, with a curious look and a sparkle in her eyes that indicated surprise. "Antonio, is that really you?" she asked, as he smiled back. He nodded, a little shyly, but without losing his composure. "Yes, it's me. I've been working here for some time," he said humbly, without being embarrassed. To him, that job represented years of dedication and growth. She seemed intrigued. "I remember you as one of the best students in the class. I always thought you would go on to college and be in an important position by now." Antonio shrugged, with a serene smile. "Life has taken me on different paths, and I've learned to value what really matters." He paused and added, "Here, I found something that many people never understand: the peace and joy of living an honest life and serving others well." Claudia was silent for a moment, admiring his sincerity. They exchanged a few words about the past, until the noise of conversation and laughter intensified. The group noticed the presence of Antonio and Claudia and began to whisper among themselves, discreetly pointing at him. Many there still saw him only as the waiter, someone who, in their eyes, had not gotten anywhere. Antonio noticed the looks and veiled laughter, but he didn't mind. He knew that those people judged him by what they saw and not by who he really was. Standing firm, he took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came, without imagining how much that night would still challenge him. As the night progressed, the restaurant filled with voices and laughter that grew louder and louder. Many of his former colleagues seemed to be competing with each other, talking about their successful careers, luxurious trips, and achievements. Antonio continued his work, attentive and friendly, always with that calm smile that, for him, was part of his commitment to each customer. Then, a group approached Claudia and Antonio, and soon one of his schoolmates recognized him. "Antonio? Damn, is that really you?" Marcelo said, with a tone that mixed surprise and contempt. He looked at Antonio, assessing him from head to toe, as if he was trying to understand why he was there, instead of in a place he considered better. "Are you working here?" Marcelo asked, not even trying to hide his judgmental tone. Antonio, without losing his composure, answered with the same calm as always. "Yes, I work here. This restaurant is like my second home." His simple and sincere words, however, seemed to increase Marcelo's disbelief, who glanced at the rest of the group. "I never imagined that the brilliant boy from school would end up waiting tables." A low laugh escaped him, and some of the other former classmates joined in, laughing too, as if they were faced with something tragicomic. Claudia watched the situation with an uncomfortable expression, clearly bothered by the disrespect from her former group of friends. She tried to intervene, but Antonio, with a gentle gesture, indicated that everything was fine. He seemed unshaken, even with the scathing comments. "Oh, you must be happy here, huh?" teased another colleague, laughing. "While we were working hard at college and making contacts, you were here, waiting tables?" Antonio remained firm, without changing his expression. "Yes, I am. To many, it may not seem like a big deal, but this job has brought me a peace that I wouldn't find anywhere else," he said, with a serenity that surprised Claudia and left the group speechless for a moment. Antonio's calm response, however, could not contain the veiled hostility. Marcelo laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, I guess everyone is content with what they can, right? Anyway, it's good to see that you're fine," he said, with a smile that didn't hide the irony. That group of former colleagues, who clearly considered themselves successful, turned their backs and returned to the table, but not before giving Antonio one last look of contempt. The provocation hurt, but he remained calm because he knew that the value of his life went beyond what they could see. When they walked away, Claudia looked at him, trying to find the right words. "Antonio, you don't need to let this affect you. They don't know your story, nor everything you've achieved in other ways." He smiled, grateful for her support. "Don't worry, Claudia. People like that cling to what shines on the outside, and often don't understand what it means to have true peace. Everyone follows their own path, and I found mine." Antonio's answer, simple and true, made Claudia admire him even more. Even in the face of hostility, he remained strong and true to his own values. At that moment, she realized that no matter how much they tried to diminish him, no one could take away Antonio's true brilliance. After a while, Antonio went back to work, waiting on tables with the same dedication as always, ignoring the looks and giggles from the group that mocked him. He knew that many there only valued what was visible, and that didn't affect him. For him, the important thing was to live an honest and dignified life, something they might never understand. Back at the table with his former colleagues, the conversations became more intense, and the teasing about Antonio became more and more frequent. Marcelo, visibly excited to impress his friends, made a point of attracting everyone's attention, talking loudly and bragging about his own achievements. "Who would have thought that our genius from school would be here, serving water and cleaning tables?" He laughed, toasting with the others. Antonio listened to the comments, but remained focused on his work. He served the dishes and took care of the customers, avoiding any confrontation. But then an unexpected situation completely changed the mood. One of Marcelo's friends, who had been laughing loudly and exaggeratedly at the provocations, began to cough uncontrollably. At first, it seemed like just a slight choking, but within a few seconds, the man began running out of breath, his expression changing from relaxed to desperate. The laughter stopped immediately. A panicked silence took over the table, and everyone's eyes turned to the man who was now struggling to breathe. Marcelo and the others, visibly confused and in shock, didn't know what to do. "Someone help!" shouted one of the women at the table, in total despair. It was then that Antonio, who was at the counter observing the situation, acted quickly. He crossed the restaurant with firm steps, approaching the man calmly and confidently. Wasting no time, he applied the first aid technique, performing a series of maneuvers to help him expel whatever was blocking his breathing. The movement was quick and precise, and in a few seconds, the man was able to breathe again, gasping for breath but relieved. Antonio's colleagues, who had previously been so sure of themselves, were now in shock, watching the scene with expressions of surprise and gratitude. Marcelo, who had been joking at Antonio's expense a few moments earlier, now didn't know where to hide his face. He looked at his friend, still trying to recover, and then at Antonio, speechless. After helping the man, Antonio patted him on the shoulder, assuring him that he was okay. "Take a deep breath and drink some water," he said with a serene smile. For Antonio, that moment wasn't a chance to shine or show off what he knew, but simply to help someone in need. Claudia, who was watching the scene from afar, felt a mixture of pride and relief. She knew that this act spoke volumes about who Antonio was, a man who put kindness and service above any judgment or provocation. Antonio's former colleagues remained silent, processing what had just happened. The figure who, moments before, had been the target of their jokes and contempt now revealed himself as someone capable of saving a life. Marcelo's expression, in particular, showed a mixture of shame and astonishment. Finally, the group returned to dinner, but the mood had changed completely. Antonio returned to the counter, as if nothing had happened, and resumed his tasks with the same calmness as before. He didn't need recognition. His satisfaction lay in knowing that he had done something good. For him, that night wasn't over yet, but deep down he felt that little by little some of his masks were beginning to fall. The mood in the restaurant changed after that incident. Antonio's former colleagues, who had previously been so sure of themselves and so ready to mock him, were now restless, with furtive glances and conversations in low voices. It was impossible to ignore what had happened. The man they had so easily underestimated had revealed himself to be much more than they could have imagined. Marcelo, who was leading the provocations, tried to hide his discomfort. He looked at Antonio with a mixture of admiration and shame, as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing him. Claudia, who had observed everything closely, felt proud and relieved at the same time. She knew Antonio wasn't the type to brag, but at that moment, she wanted everyone to know the truth about him. A little while later, while Antonio was serving a nearby table, Marcelo finally gathered the courage to stand up and approach. "Antonio, I wanted to thank you for helping my friend. If it weren't for you," he said, his words coming out a little shakily, as if they were heavy. "Well, I think he could have gotten hurt badly." Antonio, always calm and polite, smiled and made a gesture of reassurance. "No need to thank me, Marcelo. Anyone would do the same. My job here is not only to serve tables, but also to take care of the people who come in." Antonio's simple and sincere answer made Marcelo feel even more uncomfortable. He stood there for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but ended up turning around and returning to the table, head down. The others, seeing his expression, seemed to understand that something had changed. While Marcelo and his friends tried to resume their dinner, talking in lower tones, Antonio returned to the counter. Claudia approached and touched his arm, smiling. "You were incredible, Antonio. They would never imagine that someone they consider to be just a waiter could do what you did." He shrugged with a modest smile. "I learned not to care too much about what others think, Claudia. A person's value goes beyond their position or the place where they work. For me, that has always been clear." Claudia nodded, moved. "That's true, Antonio. But I think they're finally starting to see that too." As the night went on, the atmosphere became more subdued. Marcelo and his group who had previously talked loudly and laughed about material achievements, were now more introspective. That scene still echoed in each of their heads, like a silent lesson that no one dared to ignore. For Antonio, it was just another night of work. He cleaned the tables, he arranged the cutlery, and prepared the restaurant for the next customers with the same dedication. But now, as he carried out his tasks, he could feel the different looks as former. Colleagues were giving him no longer of disdain, but of respect and even curiosity. Finally, when dinner was almost over, one of Marcelo's friends, the man who had choked, stood up and approached the counter. Antonio, I just wanted to thank you again. I think you saved my life. I don't know how to repay you. Antonio smiled, making a gesture of understanding. I'm glad you're okay. You don't have to repay me. Just take care of yourself. The man nodded, grateful. He turned around, but hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to ask something more. You know, you seem so at peace. I don't always feel that way, even though I've come far. How do you do it? Antonio thought for a moment and answered simply. I think when you find something you truly love, something that gives you purpose, peace comes as a consequence. I found that here. Those words hung in the air, and the man returned to the table, visibly touched. Antonio knew there was no need to say anything else. That night, he had done more than just wait tables. He had taught everyone there's something profound. As dinner drew to a close, Antonio's colleagues were visibly different. There was no more raucous laughter or acidic comments. Instead, they spoke in low tones, and some cast furtive glances in Antonio's direction, as if they were seeing him for the first time. Even those who had not spoken to him directly were touched by what had happened. Antonio continued his work, attentive to every detail, as the restaurant began to empty. As he approached the table of Marcelo and his friends to clear the plates, he heard a deep sigh. Marcelo, who had previously seemed so sure of himself, now stared thoughtfully into the bottom of his glass. It was then that Marcelo, almost on impulse, stood up and called his friend's attention. Guys, I think we need to remember what success means. I was here the whole time, judging Antonio, while he demonstrated what really matters. And you know what? He's the real winner here. The others, surprised by the change in attitude, nodded silently. Some seemed embarrassed, remembering the comments they had made. Marcelo continued, speaking more to himself than to the others. We tried so hard to have what we have, but it never seems to be enough. It never brings the peace we see in him. Antonio, who had heard Marcelo's speech by accident, paused for a moment. He had no intention of humiliating anyone or making them feel bad. For him, all that mattered was the work and the satisfaction of knowing that he was fulfilling his purpose. But before he could say anything, Claudia, who was still by his side, smiled and took the floor. You know, Antonio, I think you teach everyone here something that is hard to find these days. The humility of service and the value of simplicity. You made them see what really matters. Marcelo, visibly touched, looked directly at Antonio. I never thought I would say this, but thank you, Antonio. Thank you for showing us that life can be so much more than status and titles. His tone was sincere, and the pride and contempt of before had disappeared. In that moment, Antonio felt that something had changed within them. Perhaps, for the first time, they were realizing that true value was not in appearances, but in character and life purpose. He looked at Marcelo and said, with his characteristic calm, "We all have our own journeys. Each one learns what is important in their own way and in their own time." The group remained silent, absorbing his words. The restaurant, which had previously been full of voices and laughter, was now a place of reflection and respect. Antonio felt a lightness in his heart. He knew that, in a way, he had helped his former colleagues see what he had already understood. That true success is living a life at peace with oneself and with others. Finally, Marcelo's friends began to get up to leave. Each of them passed by Antonio, expressing sincere thanks and shaking his hand. There was a new humility in each gesture, a sense of reconciliation with something they had not understood until then. Antonio returned the greeting with a smile and a nod, pleased to see that something greater had been awakened that night. As the last of them left through the door, Antonio turned to Claudia, who was still there, watching everything with an emotional smile. She came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Antonio, you really have something special. I think they could see it today." He smiled, a smile calm and full of gratitude. "I just did what anyone would do. And who knows, maybe one day they will find the peace that I found." And with that, the restaurant emptied out, but the impact of that night would remain forever, both for his former colleagues and for Antonio, who remained certain that a person's worth is never measured by what they had, but by who they were. After that night, the restaurant returned to its normal routine, but Antonio realized that something subtle had changed within him. The memory of meeting his former colleagues again brought to light reflections on his own path and the value of the choices he had made over the years. He never regretted choosing a simple life, far from the pressures and the incessant search for status that he saw in so many people. For him, the peace and satisfaction he felt were priceless riches. A few days later, while working, Antonio was surprised by an unexpected visit. It was Marcelo, who entered the restaurant discreetly, without the noisy group and the arrogant air he usually displayed. He seemed hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he should be there. Antonio, with his welcoming manner, waved with a smile and invited him to sit at one of the tables near the counter. "Antonio, I was passing by and thought I'd come in to talk to you," Marcelo began, clearly uncomfortable. He looked down, fidgeting with his hands as if trying to find the courage to continue. "After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. And, to be honest, I don't think I could forget your words." Antonio watched him attentively, patiently, letting him open up in his own time. Marcelo continued, now with a more sincere and vulnerable tone. "I always thought that being successful meant having everything good and the best, showing the world that I've come a long way. But when I saw you, I realized that maybe I'm chasing something empty. It seems like you've found a peace that I've never been able to achieve, and that made me think a lot." Antonio nodded, understanding, feeling that Marcelo was really trying to understand something deeper. "Marcelo, what matters in life is not what we have, but what we feel inside." He pointed to his own heart. "Sometimes, the path we choose is not the brightest in the eyes of others, but if it brings us peace, it has a value that no one can take away." Marcelo remained silent, absorbing those words. He seemed relieved, as if he had finally found someone who understood the confusion he had been carrying. "I worked so hard, Antonio, and when I thought I had achieved everything, I realized that something was missing. Maybe I never stopped to think about what really matters." Antonio smiled, placing a hand on Marcelo's shoulder. "Life is made of discoveries, and each one has their own time to learn what is essential. The important thing is that you are willing to seek this peace, to understand what makes your heart feel at home." Marcelo, with tears in his eyes, squeezed Antonio's hand gratefully. "Thank you, Antonio. I think you've given me a new perspective on life." He stood up, already feeling lighter, as if he were ready to begin a new journey. As Marcelo left, Antonio felt that something profound had been achieved. Perhaps this reunion, which he had initially viewed as just another event, had served a greater purpose. He didn't expect to change anyone's life, but he knew that sometimes the right words could make a difference. As Marcelo walked out the door, Antonio went back to work, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he didn't need recognition, applause, or approval. The true value of his life was knowing that each day he was choosing to follow his heart, and that, for him, was the greatest achievement. Time passed, and Antonio continued his routine, serving his customers with the same zeal and calmness as always. The memory of their reunion had already begun to fade, and he moved on, certain that his life choice was what brought him peace and fulfillment. One day, to his surprise, Marcelo returned to the restaurant, this time accompanied by a colleague. She seemed equally uncomfortable, but there was a glint of curiosity in her eyes, as if she was ready to hear something important. Marcelo approached Antonio with a more genuine smile this time, without the awkwardness of before. "Antonio, I hope I'm not bothering you," he began in a respectful tone. "This is Camila, my friend from work. I told her about our reunion and about the peace you seem to have. Well, we're both looking for something that will make us feel complete. Antonio waved at Camila, welcoming her with a warm smile. It's a pleasure, Camila. I'm glad you came, he said. Noticing her nervousness. Camila took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. I work hard, Antonio, and I always thought that the more I achieved, the happier I would be. But in truth, it seems that the more I chase after it, the further away happiness becomes. Marcelo told me that you found a different kind of peace, and that made me curious. How do you do it? Antonio paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes we get lost trying to seek things that seem grand to the world. But true peace comes when we find something that fills us inside, when we accept living a life that makes sense to us and not to others. Marcelo and Camila listened attentively, absorbing each word. There was a silence full of meaning. Between them, Marcelo, now more sure of himself, added, I caught myself thinking that life is like a restaurant, Antonio. We can choose the most expensive and sophisticated dishes, but that doesn't guarantee that we'll leave satisfied. Sometimes, it's the simplest things that truly nourish us. Camila smiled, touched by Marcelo and Antonio's words. She seemed less tense, as if everything suddenly made sense. Antonio, thank you for that. I think I'm slowly understanding that happiness isn't something we win like a trophy. Maybe it's more like a daily choice. Antonio nodded. Exactly, Camila. Life can be simple, and that's not a weakness. It's a way of valuing what really matters. The three of them spent some time together, talking about the little things that brought happiness and how simplicity could be a powerful choice. Antonio, who had previously thought his job was just to serve, now realized that he was helping people rediscover what really mattered. After a while, Marcelo and Camila got up to leave, but not before shaking Antonio's hand gratefully. You gave us much more than advice, Antonio. You showed us a path, Marcelo said, with a sparkle in his eyes. As they left, Antonio stared at the door with a satisfied smile. He knew that in some way, the reunion had planted seeds of change, and it filled him with a sense of purpose. After all, he didn't need great titles or status to make a difference. He had something much more valuable, the ability to touch the lives of the people around him. A few weeks after that conversation, Antonio's impact on Marcelo and Camila's lives continued to manifest itself in unexpected ways. Both had decided, each in their own way, to rethink their priorities and question the incessant race for status and achievements. Now, they were beginning to value the present and the people around them more, slowly trying to find the peace they saw in Antonio. One morning, while Antonio was getting the restaurant ready to open, he received another visitor. This time, it was a group of old schoolmates, including some of those who had participated in the provocations on the night of the reunion. At first, Antonio was surprised to see them there, but he soon noticed that their attitude was different. There was humility in their eyes and a kindness that he hadn't expected. What can I do for you? Antonio asked in his welcoming way. One of his former colleagues, Pedro, stepped forward, visibly moved. Antonio, we came here because we wanted to apologize. I think we all judged you without knowing your story, without understanding what really matters. After that night, we realized that a person's value is not in what they have or the title they carry. Antonio listened patiently, letting each person express what they felt. There was a tone of sincerity in each word, and he could see that the reunion had made a genuine impact. Pedro continued, we spent years trying to prove that we were successful, that we had come far. But in truth, we were looking for something that you have already found: balance, peace of mind, the ability to find value in the little things. Antonio nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He knew that, for some, recognizing simplicity as a valuable path was a long and challenging journey. Life has taught me that true happiness is not in achievements, but in what you do with your heart, he said calmly. And everyone has the chance to find that balance. It's not a race against anyone, it's a personal quest. Another colleague, Julia, added with tears in her eyes, Antonio, you are an inspiration. You made us realize that we don't have to follow the standards of success that the world imposes on us. I For example, always worked to have a life that would impress others, but I never felt complete. You showed that simplicity can be great. Antonio smiled, feeling grateful for having been a small light on each of their paths. I believe that life takes us by different paths so that we can learn and grow. If I could help you see something new, then all my effort was worth it. The group stayed there for a while longer, talking about their own lives, their frustrations, and their dreams. Antonio listened to them attentively, offering words of support and encouragement, reminding them that it is never too late to follow what truly brings peace to the heart. At the end of the conversation, Pedro shook Antonio's hand and smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Antonio. I know we may never have the same sparkle in our eyes that you have, but we will try." Antonio patted Pedro on the shoulder, feeling like a longtime friend. "You have already taken the first step, which is to open your heart and listen to your own truth. From here on, just keep walking one step at a time." The group said goodbye, each one taking with them a lesson in humility and a new outlook on life. Antonio stood there, watching them leave, with a deep feeling of gratitude. That morning he realized that sometimes the simplest people can transform lives in ways that the world would never fully understand. After that unexpected encounter with his former colleagues, Antonio felt an even greater peace in his heart. He was not looking for recognition, but seeing those who once despised him now seeking meaning and balance made him realize that sometimes true transformation comes from where one least expects it. He continued his work at the restaurant, as always, believing that this was his purpose. One afternoon, as he was finishing closing the cash register, a well-dressed man entered the restaurant. Antonio found the visit strange, since the restaurant was almost closed. "Can I help you?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. The man introduced himself as a representative of a prestigious charity organization. "We have been following your work, Antonio, and the way you impact people's lives. We have received reports about what you did for your former colleagues and how you helped Marcelo and Camila find new meaning in their lives." Antonio, disconcerted, tried to answer, but the man interrupted him with a smile. "You don't need to say anything. Your humility is what we admire the most. We came here because we believe that people like you deserve to be recognized, even if they never seek it." With a solemn gesture, the man handed Antonio a special invitation. He had been nominated to receive an honor for his impact on the community and for the example of simplicity and kindness he represented. The event would be broadcast, and he would have the opportunity to share his story with thousands of people. It will be a chance to inspire others, Antonio, to show that success is something much greater than titles and riches. Antonio held the invitation in shock. He had never imagined that anyone would notice his actions. After a long sigh, he thanked the man and promised to consider the invitation. But when the restaurant emptied and he was alone, he reflected on what that really meant. On the day of the event, the audience was eagerly awaiting, but to everyone's surprise, Antonio did not show up. Instead, he left a letter which was read by the host. "To those who value heart over status, love over pride, my life has always been simple, and it is in it that I have found the true meaning of happiness. I am not here because my presence is not needed. The value of what we do lies in how it affects everyday life, in small gestures, not in the spotlight. If this story can inspire someone to live with more compassion and humility, then my purpose has been fulfilled. With love, Antonio." Reading the letter moved everyone. In a world where vanity and recognition are constant targets, Antonio had chosen the path of simplicity. He had taught that the value of a life lies in the small daily choices, in the dignity with which we live, even away from the cameras and applause. Back at the restaurant, Antonio continued his work, serving each customer with the same smile and dedication as always. He knew that many would still come to learn, share stories, and seek peace. And without ever appearing on stage, Antonio became a living legend, the man who taught the true meaning of greatness, not with words or awards, but with the serenity of a life well lived.